November 1940, Berlin. Admiral Erich Raeder was convinced it would be enough to sink merchant ships at a pace sufficient to suffocate Great Britain. The doctrine was simple, cold, and calculated. The U-boat would win by invisible destruction. What the Germans called the tonnage war was, for them, an equation without an American variable. They just didn't count on Henry J. Kaiser. That same month, more than 8,000 kilometers away, a 58-year-old businessman, without any naval training, without experience in shipyards, signed a contract to build 30 ships. 2 years later, its yards would be launching a freighter every 4 days, faster than torpedoes could sink. This is the story of a rupture, not just between steel and water, but between eras. The millennial tradition of shipbuilding, slow, precise, artisanal, would be overthrown by a factory mentality. A trick of serial production, applied where only masters were accepted. This video reveals how a discredited civilian dismantled the logic of submarine warfare with efficiency, welding, and timing. When the admirals realized the ships were already afloat, instead of sinking ships, Germany would see ships sprout, 4 per week, all the same, and all of them are enough. But before we dive behind the scenes of this revolution, there is one statistic that defines this whole story. While traditional shipyards took 230 days to complete a single freighter, a civilian with no naval training built a complete ship in just 4 days. It wasn't a prototype, it wasn't a mock-up, it was steel, holds, engine and deck, ready to sail. In the middle of the war, this difference did not only mean speed, it meant survival. It meant winning by excess. Germany sank 2 ships a day. The United States, with Kaiser, went on to launch 3. If you value this kind of inquiry, this accurately told factual memory, consider liking it, subscribing and sharing this content. It keeps alive the story that changed the course of the war, not in the trenches but on the tracks of a shipyard. In 1941, the North Atlantic wasn't just a shipping lane, it was a vital line between survival and collapse. Britain, besieged on its own island, depended on a steady flow of food, ammunition, vehicles and fuel from America. Each week, hundreds of merchant ships crossed the ocean, forming long convoys escorted by destroyers and corvettes. But on the other side, in the silent depths of the Atlantic, the enemy was also organizing. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine force, had convinced Hitler that U-boats could sink Allied ships faster than shipyards would be able to replace them. He called this strategy Tonnage Krieg, the tonnage war. It was a doctrine based not on grandiose naval victories, but on statistics of destruction, and for a while it worked. In 1941 alone, more than 3.6 million tons of Allied vessels were sunk. On average, a ship every 7 hours disappeared beneath the waves. In practice, this meant less food on the shelves in London, fewer tanks in Africa, dismantled planes that would never cross the English Channel. Churchill even declared that the only time he really feared victory was during the Battle of the Atlantic. And he had reasons. The British shipyards were exhausted, bombed, slow, and the American shipyards, they were still old, heirs to a naval tradition built by hand, by men who measured precision with a hammer, not a chronometer. A standard freighter took about 230 days to build in the United States, enough time for it to be sunk twice before setting sail. The contrast was grotesque. The modernity of the war clashed with the slowness of artisanal production. Germany, even without large merchant shipyards, believed that this asymmetry would be decisive. While the Allies used ships, she destroyed them. And for a while, the numbers confirmed this faith. In January 1942, with the United States newly entered the war, U-boats sank more than 60 merchant ships on the American East Coast, off the coast of Florida. The Allied merchant marine was on the verge of logistical collapse. Vessels were already leaving the ports overcrowded, trying to make up for the shortage. Some carried tanks, jeeps, ammunition, and supplies on the same deck, all vulnerable to a single torpedo. The rate of replacement was so slower than the rate of destruction that the trains began to slow down, not for lack of demand, but for the absence of ships. And here, a fact imposes itself as a symbol of the enemy's underestimating arrogance. Until 1942, American naval production was around 1.5 million tons per year. Germany estimated that this number would not change much, even with the entry of the US into the war. But in less than 18 months, the United States has raised that production to more than 14 million tons annually, 9 times more. An unprecedented industrial leap. If this scale surprised you, write in the comments, logistics wins, because that's exactly what started to happen. And yet, on the German side, the doctrine remained. In confidential memos, Kriegsmarine officers repeated the same formula: keep the average sinking above replacement capacity. They just didn't understand that the equation had changed. What was presented in 1942 was no longer pre-war America. It was a new machine preparing to abandon the old ways. But this was still unclear to Axis strategists. They looked at the data from the previous month without seeing what would come the next month. They looked at the ships that existed without calculating those that were about to be launched. And more seriously, they still thought that shipbuilding depended exclusively on tradition, specialization, and time. In this blind silence of German doctrine, the revolution had already begun, not in the Navy's arsenals, but in muddy terrain on the coast of California. While the generals discussed sinkings, a man who had never built a ship raised the largest shipyard in history based on a simple idea. What if we do like Ford? Germany did not know. But in the American West, ships were about to be produced as if they were automobiles. Henry John Kaiser was born in 1882 in upstate New York, far from the ports, ships, and naval traditions that shaped the American maritime elite. He grew up without inheritances, without formal diplomas, and without ties to the establishment. But over the first 4 decades of the 20th century, it became one of the largest civilian contractors in the United States. His specialty was not sailing. It was moving mountains, raising cities, channeling rivers. He was responsible for roads in Latin America, monumental dams such as the Hoover Dam, and projects that required logistics, scale, and speed. Kaiser did not build delicately. He built urgently. Its construction sites operated at an industrial pace, guided by strict schedules and an absolute belief in the strength of the process. He was a man shaped by concrete and organization, not naval steel or maritime traditions. And perhaps precisely because of this, he was the only one capable of seeing the obvious, that the war would not be won with technical pride, but with volume. In 1940, when he signed his first contract with the Maritime Commission, Kaiser was just a new name among established giants of the shipping industry. Most engineers considered him an opportunist. After all, he had never even built a fishing boat. He was seen as an intruder, a mason in an architect's salon. But there was something about that man that bothered him. He asked questions that no one asked. Why did ships need to be built from scratch, from start to finish, always in sequence? Why did a welder need to master every detail of his craft when perhaps it was enough for him to excel at a single seam? Why did the shipyards look like museums and not factories? These questions sounded naive, but they brought a real danger. They exposed the rigidity of a paralyzed system. Kaiser had built dams with tens of thousands of workers with no prior experience. He had built bridges in the middle of the desert with scarce supplies and impossible deadlines. Their philosophy was simple: standardize, simplify, mass train, and accelerate. And he saw no reason why ships should be an exception. To the naval bureaucracy, his lack of experience was a threat, but for the logic of war, it was an advantage. Kaiser did not respect traditions, he respected the deadline. And the war now demanded absurd deadlines. His first contract was to build 30 cargo ships for the British government, at a time when Britain was losing ships faster than it could name them. Traditional shipyards turned up their noses. Todd Bath Iron Works, a veteran shipyard in Maine, agreed to work with Kaiser only because they believed they could control the project. The deal was clear. Kaiser would finance, but the veterans would be in charge. That was what they thought. What they didn't understand was that Kaiser didn't just want to finance. He wanted to rewrite the playbook. He didn't want to build an ordinary shipyard. He wanted to set up a production line. In technical meetings, he took short notes, looked at schedules with disdain, and asked questions that made engineers feel embarrassed. How many welds can you do per hour? How many men does it take to position a section of hull? Why do you do everything in sequence if you can make parallel? These questions seemed banal, but each of them dismantled a pillar of traditional shipbuilding. It was the look of someone who built concrete dams with alternating 24-hour crews, and who now saw the ship not as a masterpiece, but as a product. Germany believed that American shipyards would remain attached to naval art. And in fact, most of them were. Except for one civilian who asked more questions than he said. Kaiser did not have the dogmas of tradition, and precisely for this reason, he created new doctrines. Instead of looking for the beauty of the lines, he sought efficient repetition. Instead of relying on master craftsmen, it created serial training for specific functions. Experience for him was replaced by controlled specialization. It was like assembling a team of workers who knew only one piece of the puzzle, but who executed that piece thousands of times, with industrial perfection. His mantra was not aesthetics, but speed. He understood that war was a race, and that winning meant only one thing: delivering first. While the German admirals were making projections based on the previous year's American naval production, Kaiser was already rehearsing a quiet turn. In less than 6 months, he would turn an empty swamp on the West Coast into a proving ground for the greatest logistical revolution of the war. And the first step in this turning point began when its chief engineer visited a Ford plant. There, he saw something he would never forget: an automobile chassis being assembled in minutes, prefabricated parts, workers trained for a single function, and everything in constant motion. That was not a factory. It was a choreography of steel. And Kaiser, upon hearing the report, would have only one reaction: if we can do this with a car, we can do it with a ship. The enemy was still laughing, but the production line was already being designed. In the spring of 1941, Clay Bedford, Henry Kaiser's chief engineer, made a visit that would change the course of the war. Sent to Detroit, he went to see the assembly lines of the Ford Motor Company up close. What he found there was not just a factory, it was a new universe. In metal sheds under cold lights and the relentless rhythm of sirens and mats, workers performed timed gestures. Each employee was responsible for a minimal action: a screw, a weld, a lever. Nothing was made from scratch. Everything was prefabricated. The body was not born from the imagination of a craftsman, but from identical molds repeated on a massive scale. Bedford saw the chassis of a car move from station to station, receiving ready-made pieces until it became a complete vehicle in a matter of hours. It was an industrial dance, and more importantly, it was logical. When he returned to California, Bedford took with him more than notes. He took a conviction. If America could assemble a car in hours with semi-literate labor, why couldn't it assemble ships in the same way? It was a question that no shipyard asked itself. The shipbuilding industry, up to that point, was still guided by almost medieval principles. Ships were erected like cathedrals, with masters of craft, long rituals, and almost symbolic deadlines. Each unit was a unique work. Bedford presented the idea to Kaiser in a meeting that lasted less than an hour. In the end, the plan was approved. They would try to turn shipbuilding into a production line. The proposal seemed absurd, but absurdities are often invisible until someone executes them. The first measure was the most radical: abandoning riveting. For centuries, ships had been built with steel plates overlapping and held together by rivets, metal pins heated to red and hammered by teams of 4 or 5 men in perfect sync. It was an art, time-consuming, expensive, and limited by human fatigue. On a good day, a team could install about 100 rivets. A ship like the Liberty would require up to 1 million. Kaiser proposed to eliminate this with a single blow: electric welding. The idea shocked the Navy. The weld was viewed with suspicion: structural fragility, invisible flaws, risk of fractures. The British Royal Navy itself had banned the extensive use of welding on its warships, but Kaiser wasn't building warships. He was building ships that needed to float, cross the Atlantic, and come back. They didn't have to be eternal. They had to be enough. The difference between perfection and functional was the space where victory could be born. Bedford coordinated the training of hundreds of inexperienced workmen, teaching them how to weld specific segments of the hull. Most had never worked with metal before. It was not necessary. They wouldn't weld everything, just the same joint, the same seam, the same thread. Repeatedly, it was minimum specialization on a maximum scale. The second step was the creation of a modular system. Instead of building the ship from scratch, from keel to deck in sequence, they would assemble complete sections separately. While one crew set up cargo hold number 1, another set up the engine room, a third welded the bow, and another prepared the stern. When all the blocks were ready, 150-ton cranes positioned them as pieces of an industrial puzzle. The final assembly was a steel fitting. And it worked. Instead of 6 months, the first ship left in less than 200 days, the second in 160, then 120. Time began to fall as quickly as incredulity increased. Meanwhile, in Germany, the doctrine remained firm. The Kriegsmarine invested in projects such as the Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary submarine. which required years of engineering and artisanal assembly. A technical pride, no doubt, but slow and scarce. For every submarine launched by the Germans, the Americans were months away from launching 100 freighters. The contrast was silent but lethal. An internal U.S. Navy report dated July 1942 stated that Kaiser production poses a strategic risk to the adversary as it shifts the axis from war of destruction to that of mass replacement. It was the recognition of a fundamental change. The battlefield moved from the waters to the workshops. When the German admirals received news of the first Liberties built in less than 100 days, they doubted the information. When they learned that workers with no naval history were producing entire sections, they considered propaganda. When they heard about plans to weld entire hulls in less than a week, they laughed. But the laughter began to die down as the trains grew again, when ships stopped looking unique and began to emerge as clones, when naval intelligence began to notice that the Liberties were numbered as line products. It was a new phase, one where ships were no longer made, they were assembled. And while German reports tried to explain the phenomenon, Kaiser was preparing his boldest move, proving that it was possible to build a complete freighter in less than 10 days, and not as an isolated case, but as a model, as standard, as a challenge to the very logic of war. The American naval tradition in 1941 was not just a technical issue, it was a matter of honor. East Coast shipyards, many of which had built cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers since World War I, saw themselves as custodians of a centuries-old art. Its walls displayed bronze plaques, its sheds carried the smell of oil and accumulated prestige. And among these men, the idea of a civilian, a concrete barber as they began to call him, produced ships in a straight line, and with electric welding didn't just sound wrong, it sounded offensive. The internal reports of the Navy Bureau of Ships, revealed years later, made the institutional stance clear. Kaiser was seen as an agitator, an intruder, a dangerous man for not knowing enough to understand why it could not be done. In closed-door meetings, experienced officers laughed at the idea of gluing ships with soldering as if they were sardine cans. One of the most emblematic memoranda, signed by a veteran engineer, said, "Mr. Kaiser's methods may work in dams and sewers, but ships require more than concrete and haste. They require a soul." It was this belief that sustained the resistance, the conviction that ships could not and should not be manufactured as disposable goods. The shipyard was a temple, the naval master, a priest, and then came Kaiser with schedules instead of prayers and factory workers instead of rivet masters. The response from the old guard was immediate: rejection. The National Association of Shipbuilders has published articles condemning the technical devaluation of the profession. The guilds demanded that the Navy limit the use of welding to non-structural parts. Even the trade press entered the battle, calling the Liberty ships Frankenstein freighters. The Liberty was ugly, square, utilitarian, a cocoon of steel without curves, without poetry, and, for many, without a future. But while traditional shipyards produced naval engineering masterpieces every 6 months, Kaiser delivered seaworthy steel blocks within 40 days. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but it seemed too simple to respect. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts with accuracy and context, show your support. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring you detailed behind-the-scenes analysis of the story. Because what comes next is even more symbolic. In the face of so much institutional contempt, Kaiser decided to double down. In 1942, without formal authorization, he ordered the construction of the first fully welded Liberty, assembled by non-specialized teams, with prefabricated parts in sequence. It was the prototype of heresy, and it was delivered before the deadline. When the freighter floated flawlessly, the Navy did not celebrate. Silenced. One officer even wrote, "Maybe they won't break in the sea, but still they are not real ships." The conflict was installed. On the one hand, perfection with delay. On the other, mass functionality. In 1943, this clash would have a clear answer, not in the sheds but in the waters, because that year the pace of production at the Kaiser shipyards was about to outpace the pace of sinking in Germany. And when that happened, German silence ceased to be strategic. It became fear. In January 1941, the west bank of the city of Richmond, California, was just a swampy lot on the edge of the San Francisco Bay. A little more than 9 months later, that same soil, previously muddy and uninhabited, housed the largest shipyard on the planet, 4 operational units, 40,000 workers, 15 dry docks, cranes installed every 100 meters, rails crisscrossing the tracks like veins of steel. Richmond wasn't built, it was assembled, and this detail is not symbolic. It reveals the essence of Kaiser's trick, not to turn a plot of land into a shipyard, but to turn a shipyard into a factory. From the beginning, the logic was the opposite of that of the naval tradition. Instead of adapting the workers to the ship was adapted to the workers. The structure was not designed to accommodate master craftsmen, but to receive trainable laypeople. The layout was more reminiscent of a General Motors assembly line than any naval base. The ship's sections were prefabricated in parallel hangars, in 250-ton modules, and then transported by internal rails to the docks, where huge cranes lowered them onto the keels with inches accuracy. It was the opposite of what traditional shipyards did. Instead of slowly lifting ships in the same place, one was mounted on each line as if they were cargo trucks. Each Liberty was over 250 meters long, with 3 cargo holds, internal cranes, engine room, boilers, steering system, radio, and complete living quarters. Still, it was segmented as an industrial puzzle. The hull came in blocks. The chimney was mounted separately. The electrical cables were already pre-installed in panels. What used to take weeks now takes hours. The movement of heavy parts, previously done with wooden blocks and hundreds of synchronized workers, was replaced by cranes on rails and a standardized system of fitting. A bow section took 12 hours to position and weld, less time than was previously spent to manufacture the rivets that would join it. The shipyard had cafeterias for 10,000 people, an internal transport system, a welding school with 3-day courses, and an assembly manual by color. Each team wore colored helmets to identify their role: blue for welders, red for crane workers, yellow for electricians. Instead of a master commanding all sectors, each phase of the process had a shift supervisor with hourly goals and a performance sheet. The pace was so disciplined that there were sirens indicating breaks, start of shifts, and return to work. At night, floodlights transformed the shipyard into a city that did not sleep. They worked in 3 continuous shifts, 7 days a week. Meanwhile, in Germany, U-boat Type 7 class submarines were built on individual lines. Each one required between 8 and 12 months of assembly, with reduced teams, highly specialized techniques and deadlines incompatible with the scale of the conflict. The technical pride of the German shipyards was real, but so was their prison. Isolated excellence became irrelevant in the face of mass mediocrity. And Richmond didn't produce beauty, it produced results. In less than 12 months, 43 Liberty ships were delivered. The following year there would be more than 200, and this in just one of the shipyards. Kaiser alone operated on 7. The US Navy began to redesign its own logistical criteria based on Kaiser production. The question is no longer, how many ships do we have, and has become, how many ships will we have by the end of the month? The impact was so great that the plans to invade Normandy only became feasible because the Liberties would guarantee fuel, ammunition, and food without interruption, even with losses on the high seas. Was a freighter sunk? Another was already on the way. Logistics is no longer fragile. It has become redundant, and German intelligence reports began to show concern. In a 1943 document, a Kriegsmarine officer wrote, "The industrial pace of the Americans defies any European analogy. They build as if time didn't exist." That phrase marked the turning point. The enemy no longer laughed. I no longer underestimated. I just didn't know how to answer. And worse, I still didn't know that Kaiser was about to break his own record, because behind the scenes in Richmond, a secret project was initiated. The ship's name, SS Robert E. Peary. The goal, to assemble it, from start to finish, in less than 5 days. They did not wear uniforms. They did not land on beaches. They did not wield rifles, but without them no soldier would have ammunition, fuel, or food. They were secretaries who had left their typewriters to operate cranes. They were Georgia farmers who exchanged the plow for the welding mask. They were housewives from Pennsylvania who until months before had never held a wrench and now sealed the hulls of a 10,000-ton freighter. Kaiser's miracle workers were not in the history books, but they were in the 12-hour shifts, in the endless welds, in the improvised cafeterias and in the daycare centers attached to the shipyard. They came from everywhere. Blacks from the American South, rejected by traditional factories, found in Richmond a door that had never opened before. European immigrants, many of whom barely spoke English, were given visual instruction based on color and gesture. Women, thousands of them, have taken on roles considered masculine for centuries. They operated cranes, forklifts, sanders, presses and welding torches with surgical precision. Kaiser didn't pick the best. He trained them all. At his technical school, a worker was trained to perform a single task in up to 3 days. Weld a joint, paint a hull, snap a section. They didn't need to understand the ship. They needed to repeat it exactly. The workforce, like the ships themselves, was modular, and like ships, it took shape through repetition. The rotation was high. Many arrived without knowing where the bow was, but within a week they were ready for the line. Supervisors maintained daily goals, technical reviews, and constant training routines. Each function had an illustrated manual. Each station had redundancy. If one worker was absent, another took over in minutes. It was a collective organism, a social machine. And despite the gigantism, there was something profoundly human about that system. There was laughter in the pauses. There was music on the docks. There were lines for the cafeterias that served 4,000 meals per hour. There were mothers who left their children at the shipyard's nursery and then returned to welding. There were newlyweds who knew each other between cranes. There were soldiers on leave who volunteered to paint hooves out of patriotism. And there was, above all, a sense of urgency, of mission, of belonging. They knew that with each ship delivered, lives would be saved. They knew that every day one was a frustrated submarine patrol. And this collective consciousness, born of the war, generated a new type of American worker, less technical, more disciplined, less specialist, more functional. It wasn't the genius engineer. It was the piece that moved the whole. And this set produced results. By April 1943, the Richmond shipyard was already delivering a ship every 5 days. In the following months, this number would drop even more. Germany, in trying to stifle Allied logistics, did not understand that it had awakened the greatest social factory in modern history. The effort was not just military. It was civilian, it was communal, and it was uncontrollable. A classified German intelligence report, intercepted after the war, contained a cryptic phrase written by a naval officer: "America makes ships as if it made bread." This phrase, which sounded like a metaphor, was actually a logistical finding. American naval production had ceased to be technical and had become routine, repeatable, popular, and that meant that the enemy was no longer just fighting soldiers, it was facing an entire factory-turned nation. And the best example of this phenomenon would come in the form of a specific ship, a Liberty whose construction time would break all known statistics. The name SS Robert E. Peary. The promised deadline, less than 5 days. The actual time frame, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. For centuries, naval engineering has been guided by an unspoken commandment to build the best ship possible. Every bend, every riveting, every joint was designed to last for decades. It was a prestigious art, with its own schools, traditions, and metrics. But in 1942, Henry J. Kaiser shattered this logic with a brutally functional new doctrine. The adequate is worth more than the ideal. Liberty ships were not beautiful. They had rough lines, visible welds, and engines based on outdated designs from the 1920s. Their steel plates did not always fit perfectly. Many had to be cut by force at the time of welding. They weren't designed to impress. They were designed to float, cross the Atlantic, unload cargo, and if possible, return. If they broke on the way back, so be it. The essential thing was that they completed the journey once. This philosophy, simple and almost offensive to traditional engineers, saved tens of thousands of lives. And more, it has become official doctrine. The Navy and the Maritime Commission began to classify freighters no longer by technical excellence, but by basic reliability. Good enough replaced great. While the classic shipyard still struggled for millimeter accuracy, Kaiser's shipyards measured productivity per ton delivered per week. It was the victory of function over pride. And the irony is that by abandoning the search for perfection, the freedoms ended up more reliable than imagined. They had fewer points of failure, required less maintenance, and could be easily repaired in remote ports. On the other hand, the European ships of the line, built with exquisite craftsmanship, required highly trained technical teams for each adjustment. The contrast was clear in a non-negotiable fact. In 1943, the Liberties represented 27% of the Allies' logistical capacity, even though they were considered at the time temporary ships. The German obsession with superior design, the perfect machine, the revolutionary submarine, engineering without compromise. It failed in the face of the repetition on a scale of enough. And if you were surprised by this, consider this number. In 1943, the US produced 3 times as many ships as all of Germany did between 1939 and 1945. That's right, 3 times as much in a single year. If this data impresses you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because this sentence summarizes what was at stake. German engineers, heirs to centuries of precision, created incredible machines, but not enough in number. Kaiser, with ordinary workmen and crude steel, created an army of medium-sized ships, but in absolute quantity. That was the moral rupture of the war. Absolute quality did not defeat adequate volume, and this logic, increasingly accepted behind the scenes of the Allied command, was about to be taken to the extreme, because Kaiser's next step would not just be to deliver a ship in 4 days. It would prove that his doctrine could be replicated by anyone, anywhere, even where it was never imagined to build ships. On the morning of November 8, 1942, just before sunrise, a crowd began to gather in the vicinity of Permanent Shipyard No. 2 in Richmond. They were workers, journalists, Navy technicians, and skeptics coming from other states. Everyone was there to witness what many called a publicity stunt, and others an impossible miracle. The target of the collective attention was a Liberty-class cargo ship named SS Robert E. Peary. But what differentiated him was not the name nor the destination. It was time, because that ship had been entirely assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. A promise that seemed reckless. It is a reality that defied all known naval engineering. The process began with quiet preparation. In the previous months, Kaiser had had complete sections of the ship manufactured in advance. Each block, hold, deck, engine room, rudder, smokestack, captain's cabin, was produced in separate hangars at a controlled pace. The main engine was tested outside the hull, turned on and calibrated on an external support, something unheard of until then. The assembly infrastructure was expanded. Each crane has rehearsed its trajectory dozens of times. The teams were divided into 6-hour shifts with timed changes. Every welder knew exactly where to start, at what angle, at what depth. There was no room for improvisation. At 00 down on November 6th, the first section touched the assembly cradle. By noon, 4 blocks were already welded. At midnight, the hull took shape. On the second day, the deck was already in place. In the third, electrical integration began. In the bedroom, the engine was fitted and connected in less than 7 hours. Preliminary tests were carried out while the last adjustments were made. And at dawn on the 5th day, SS Robert E. Peary glided into the water, floating, stable, operational. What happened next would seal the fate of all American naval doctrine. Vice Admiral Emory Land, until then a fierce critic of Kaiser's methods, watched from the tribune of honor. He had said months earlier that boats are not cookies, and that the attempt to industrialize ships was a threat to national security. Now, in front of a crowd and reporters, he walked up to the microphone, took a deep breath, and declared, "As of today, he is no longer an exception. It's the new normal." The phrase was recorded by radios and newspapers. Within 48 hours, an official memo from the Maritime Commission instructed all East Coast shipyards to reorganize their production methods according to the Richmond model. War no longer waited for tradition. I was being overcome by repetition, and the symbol of this turning point was a ship built by ordinary people with common tools in extraordinary time. Kaiser's shipyards had overturned centuries of orthodoxy with a simple statistic: 4 days. And the Germans knew it. An internal Kriegsmarine report, dated January 1943, classified the American industrial pace as outside the bounds of technical analysis. One of the officers wrote, "Their production is no longer comprehensible. Now it's a matter of faith." But the most impressive thing was yet to come, because the Liberty ships, contrary to what their critics predicted, would not only be useful, they would be eternal. Many of them would sail for decades, participate in new wars, cross oceans, become civilian ghosts carrying grain, coal, oil. What was born as improvisation became a legacy, and the doctrine of functional efficiency, of enough for it to work, has not only survived but has shaped the modern world. And at the center of this transformation was the man who dared to compare ships to cars, and that, to the astonishment of the admirals, proved to be right. The sea had always been the Kriegsmarine's favorite field, silent, vast, relentless. It was here that German commanders believed the war could be won without major battles, only by the cold logic of scarcity. Since 1939, the plan was clear: to sink more than the enemy could replace. Dönitz repeated this as a mantra. For every Allied ship crossing the Atlantic, a U-boat would be lurking. Torpedoes would replace warehouses. The arithmetic of despair would guarantee victory. And for a while it worked. But in mid-1943 something began to crumble. The statistical standard, the basis of the doctrine, was inverted. For the first time, the Allies were launching more ships than they lost. It was a quiet but devastating inflection. In September, the average reached 3 ships launched per day, while the U-boats sank only 2. This was not just a sign of recovery. It was the collapse of an entire strategy. British intelligence reports, analyzing American production patterns, indicated something that many were still hesitant to accept. Kaiser's shipyards were modifying the natural rhythm of warfare. It was no longer a question of replacing losses, but of anticipating needs. The Allied fleet grew as it was attacked. With each torpedo fired, 2 new freighters left California ports. The Kriegsmarine realized this too late. An internal document, dated December 1943, was circulated among the high commands of the German Navy. In it, an officer warned, "The tonnage war is no longer viable. American production has made our estimates irrelevant." The sentence was more than an analysis. It was a confession. Dönitz, once confident that serial destruction of the convoys would end British resistance, now saw his submarines being hunted with ferocity, while Liberty ships formed unbroken columns between New York, Liverpool, and North Africa. The war in the Atlantic was no longer combat. It was a tonnage race. Naval theater was no longer defined by tactical ability, but by replacement capacity. And in this new field, the Americans had an invincible arsenal: time. While German submarines took up to a year to build, and another 2 months of testing and training, the Liberties were ready in weeks, and with civilian crews adapted to war transport. The German nightmare was taking shape. For every train destroyed, 2 appeared. With each attempt to block the flow multiplied. Routes were reinforced, ships replaced, escort systems modernized. And more serious, the Allied data now showed that even with monthly losses of more than 200,000 tons, the logistical impact was nil. The losses were absorbed without shock. It was the beginning of what strategists would call logistical supremacy, a new concept which put production ahead of combat, a new way to win, not by direct confrontation, but by the inevitability of surrender. The British began to monitor American ship launches as a barometer of strategic success. At a War Cabinet meeting in London in January 1944, Churchill declared, "American industry has made war possible. Your ships are the road on which we march." The phrase would be remembered for decades, and meanwhile, in Germany, the reports were becoming increasingly gloomy. The Navy asked for more submarines. The industry could not deliver them. The doctrine called for more destruction. The enemy kept growing. In a rare moment of candor, a German admiral recorded in a personal diary, "They don't have to be better than us. They just keep coming." And this observation, simple, mathematical, merciless, was the echo of what Henry Kaiser had said 2 years earlier when asked why his ships were not more refined. Because they don't have to be perfect, there need to be many, and many they have become. To the point that in 1944, the Liberties became more numerous than all the freighters in German naval history combined. But the true measure of the impact was yet to come, because these ships didn't just replace losses. They prepared the largest military landing in history, and they turned the theory of logistics into a weapon of invasion. What began as a desperate attempt to speed up production became, in a matter of months, an unprecedented social and industrial phenomenon. With Henry Kaiser's methods proven, something new emerged: rivalry, but not between nations, between shipyards. Richmond, California, against Swan Island, in Portland, Oregon. They were steel brothers competing for the same invisible title, the fastest factory of the war. The fuse came with the launch of the SS Joseph N. Teal in July 1942. Built in just 10 days, the ship surprised not only the Navy, but the workers themselves. The news was printed in newspapers as if it were an Olympic feat. Headlines compared the shipyards to marathon runners. Interviews with welders, crane operators, and inspectors took up the space that had previously been reserved for generals. It was the birth of the record time culture. Each turn turned into a race, each new hull a challenge. In Richmond, the answer came immediately. We can do it in 9. In Portland, the provocation followed. 8. There were no prizes, just pride. And this pride has become an engine of productivity. Workers who had previously worked to meet targets now competed to exceed them. Timers have become part of the environment. Daily performance boards were posted in the corridors. Each assembly group knew how long rivals were taking. Welding, which was previously timed by the hour, is now measured by the minute. A single day of delay was treated as a moral defeat. But what could have turned into chaos became a method. Rivalry was organized, encouraged, and even financed. The Maritime Commission began to distribute resources and bonuses based on efficiency, speed, and minimum quality. The unions, once skeptical, now published bulletins praising the team's patriotic discipline. The factories received visits from foreign delegations. On one such visit, a French naval commander likened Richmond to a port of war where the enemy is time. The analogy was perfect. Because more than steel or technique, what was faced there was urgency. The urgency of supplying a war that consumed fuel, food, ammunition, vehicles, troops, and hope. And each ship delivered meant more than tons. It meant continuity. It was the vital link between the rear and the front line. The pinnacle of this run came with the SS Robert E. Peary. After Joseph N. Teal's performance, the Richmond workers issued a challenge: assemble a Liberty in less than 5 days. The engineers said it was impossible. The Navy, cautious, did not want to get involved. But the workers had already begun. They organized 6-hour shifts, reviewed schedules, adjusted every logistical detail. When the Peary went overboard in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes, the newspapers announced it as if it were a sporting feat. "The world stopped to watch," wrote the San Francisco Chronicle. It was not an exaggeration. The feat had international repercussions, and what few saw at that time was that this dispute between shipyards was not just about speed. It was about organized efficiency. Every second saved on the crane meant seconds saved on the dock. Each simplification in the fitting of sections saved hours in welding. And this refinement, made by thousands of hands, shaped a new era of series production. The war, ironically, was the cradle of what decades later would be called just-in-time, lean manufacturing, modular production, modern terms, which were born among cranes and sirens. And the fuel of all this, it was not state-of-the-art technology. It was not a new metal alloy. It was human rivalry. It was the pride of seeing his shipyard at the top of the list. It was the invisible force of the worker who wanted to prove that his team was better. The war, therefore, was not won with bombs alone. It was won with clocks. And soon, these ships, born of competition between yards, would be the pillars of an invasion that would change the course of history. Because they weren't just being built to cross the Atlantic, they were being prepared to fight their way on the beaches of Normandy. For decades, the great American shipyards were treated as cathedrals of naval ingenuity. Its engineers wore white coats, its warehouses functioned as temples of precision, and its processes were protected by almost sacred norms and traditions. The New York Shipbuilding Corporation, founded in 1899, was one such institution. Bethlehem Steel, with its monumental shipyards on the East Coast, is another. These corporations produced ships as if they were carving monuments. Every rivet was revised, every curve of the hull calculated by naval architects with decades of experience. But in 1943, something began to change. Internal reports, previously full of self-confidence, began to register a tone of discomfort. In September, a delegation of Bethlehem engineers visited the Richmond shipyards at the request of the War Department. What they saw there contradicted everything they had learned. The blocks were assembled by workers without technical training. The sections were welded in real time, rain and wind, without the scaffolding cathedrals of the East Coast. And yet, the ships were ready, faster, cheaper, and with fewer technical failures than theirs. On the way back, the report delivered to the board left no room for pride. "We need to abandon our way of thinking." The phrase was recorded in the minutes and echoed as a verdict. The collapse was not technical, it was ideological. For the first time, the masters of the tradition admitted that they had been overtaken by a stranger, a man without a naval curriculum, no degree in engineering, a civilian. The impact was profound. New York shipbuilding, which until then had led the Navy's production of escort ships, began a structural overhaul. It halved the time it took to assemble sections, standardized once handmade components, and trained its engineers to apply assembly line principles. The Kaiser Doctrine, as it came to be called in industrial circles, became the new gospel of shipbuilding. At a confidential meeting of the War Production Board in December 1943, a Bethlehem director stated, "What Kaiser did was to show that our prestige was holding us back." The phrase was brutal, but true. Newspapers began to notice the change. Once enthusiastic articles of the tradition now extolled the new school of Richmond. The Chicago Tribune called the Kaiser Shipyards the industrial heart of liberty. Time magazine published a dossier titled The Four-Day Empire, describing the fall of resistance among industrial elites. But the most surprising recognition came from abroad. American intelligence intercepted a letter from a German naval engineer sent to the Kiel base, which read, "They don't follow rules, they destroy them and still work," a phrase that summarizes the total inversion of logic. The US did not win the naval battle by improvement. It won by abandonment. They abandoned consecrated methods. They have abandoned the European model of individual excellence. They even abandoned total control of technical knowledge. They allowed civilians to operate critical processes, that women would train other women, that non-fluent immigrants operated boilers. And with that, they built a force that no tradition could stop. And if that clash is still unclear, consider this. Between 1941 and 1945, the US built more than 2,700 Liberty ships. Germany in the same period produced just over 2,100 operational submarines. Comment below with "shocking data" if this scale of production surprises you, because this difference was not just industrial, it was doctrinal. It was the bankruptcy of the idea that only specialists produce quality, and that collapse, discreet and devastating, redefined naval engineering forever. But the greatest irony would come soon after, because even after copying Kaiser's methods, traditional shipyards still couldn't overcome their efficiency. And in view of this, a new shipyard would be created, in record time, to produce ships at even greater speed. By mid-1944, what had begun as an anomaly, a civilian daring to defy centuries of naval tradition, was no longer an exception. It was the norm. The Kaiser method, once viewed with derision, now dictated the parameters of American naval production. Of the 18 shipyards involved in the manufacture of Liberty ships, all have adopted electric welding in place of traditional riveting. All operated with prefabricated sections, all standardized processes, supply lines, and schedules. The impossible had become standard, and with that the numbers began to defy logic. The average time to build a Liberty, which in 1941 was 230 days, dropped to 70 in 1942, 42 in 1943, and reached 30 days in 1944. This was no longer an isolated revolution. It was the consecration of a national doctrine. The industrial war in the United States was entering its full phase, where the decisive factor was no longer only bravery on the battlefield, but efficiency on the production line. Every 7 days, shipyards launched more ships than Germany had produced in all of 1940. It was as if, weekly, a new floating army was placed on the seas, and these ships were not empty. They carried tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, medicines, dismantled planes, and hundreds of soldiers. American logistics were no longer just functional, they were offensive. Each Liberty launched meant not only replacement, but projection. The Allies, who had previously struggled to survive, now advanced with excess. And what the Germans called disorganized industry proved to be a systematic and ruthless machine. In a confidential memorandum dated May 1944, the Oberkommando der Marine acknowledged that the American pace is beyond our capacity to respond. It was a strategic admission. Germany, which had relied on secret weapons, heavy tanks, and silent submarines, now faced an enemy that needed no secrets, only constancy. And what most worried the German High Command was not the direct military advance. It was mathematical inevitability. Every day, more ships, more men, more tons. With each retreat, the Allies were more supplied. By 1944, the Richmond shipyards alone had produced 747 ships, a single complex larger than the entire pre-war Italian merchant fleet. And since the data doesn't lie, it's worth a moment of pause. American production of ships during World War II exceeded 5,000 large vessels. Germany's naval production in the same period was below 1,500. If this scale impresses you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what happened. Victory began to be measured not only by kilometers conquered, but by ships delivered. And in this scenario, the shipyards were no longer factories. They were weapons. The doctrine of adequate functional, consolidated, the philosophy of systematized, triumphant repetition, the impossible, had ceased to be a miracle and had become the minimum acceptable. But the impact of this turn would not only be numerical. The normalization of the impossible set the stage for the greatest logistical move in military history, the transfer of a continental force to an occupied coast. And the ships that would do that wouldn't be polished steel. They would be the flawed children of a perfect-paced war. While the wheels of naval production turned at superhuman speed, an even more profound revolution was taking place in silence, not in the offices of the high command, but in the docks, in the workshops, and in the mess halls. It was a social revolution, forged under pressure, fueled by necessity and sustained by voices that until then had not been heard. In the Richmond shipyards in 1944, more than 40,000 women worked side by side with men, performing functions that a few years earlier would have been forbidden to them even by law. They operated cranes, welded hulls, adjusted boilers, assembled turbines. They were called Rosies, an allusion to the iconic image of the American working-class woman, but the reality was harsher, cruder, and more heroic than any propaganda poster. These women learned to work under pressure, without recognition, with 10 to 12-hour shifts dealing with heavy equipment, deafening noises and suspicious looks. Many had left small children at home. Others took care of the house and returned to the dawn shift. Alongside them, thousands of African Americans, men and women, have found an unprecedented opportunity in Richmond. Coming from the segregated South, where the doors of industry were closed, they began to operate the largest machines in one of the largest factories on the planet. Black welders became team leaders. African American supervisors began taking on full shifts. The logic was simple but revolutionary. Competence was more important than color. In peacetime, this would be unthinkable, but in war, efficiency could not afford prejudice. It was a paradigm shift that put Kaiser's shipyards ahead not only of Germany, but of time itself. While the Third Reich preached racial purity and absolute hierarchy, the United States, even with all its internal contradictions, showed that strength came from the sum, integration, the full use of human potential. The contrast was brutal. The black workers in the American shipyards produced more ships than all the naval production of the Axis. And they did it with welds that held, engines that worked and ships that floated. The unknown African-American welder who welded the keel of the SS Booker T. Washington, the first Liberty ship commanded by a black captain, did more for the Allied victory than many generals with decorations. His name was never recorded, but his work crossed oceans, and there were thousands like him. Records from the time show that in Richmond, 1 in 5 workers was black. Nearly 40% of the workers were immigrants or children of immigrants. English was spoken with an accent. Communication sometimes was done with gestures, but the efficiency was unquestionable. And that diversity, this ecosystem of ordinary people united by an extraordinary mission, became the secret force behind the largest logistical operation in history. In the internal memos of the War Production Board, discreet but revealing praise emerges. Integrating civilian labor in Richmond increased shift performance by 18%. Another note, the learning curve of unskilled workers stabilized in less than 3 weeks. These numbers were not printed in the newspapers, but they sustained the liberties on the waters. It was the victory of pragmatism over prejudice, and more than that, the demonstration that the enemy had underestimated not only American technique, but its society. Germany, which based its strength on ideological purity, systematic exclusion, and a rigid vision of human value, was faced with a paradox. The logistical army that threatened the Axis was built by those who, in its own regime, would be considered disposable. This moral irony is one of the hidden pillars of Allied victory. With each ship that left Richmond, it wasn't just steel and fuel that crossed the Atlantic. It was also a message. Real strength doesn't come from rigidity. It comes from adaptation. America's war force molded itself like its workers, with visible welds, pragmatic seams, functional imperfections, but with an effectiveness that no disciplined empire could overcome. And soon these same workers, women, blacks, immigrants, would be building something even bigger, because the next wave of ships would not only carry supplies, it would lead to the invasion itself. When the last torpedo was launched and the last Liberty crossed the Atlantic, the guns fell silent. But in the Richmond shipyards, what was left was not just steel and grease. It was an idea, a doctrine that would survive the war. The assembly line, the prefabricated block, electric welding, extreme standardization, everything that had been seen as naval heresy in 1941 would become, in the following decades, the foundation of global industry. In Tokyo, where American bombs had torn entire cities apart, civil engineers began to study US production reports in detail, and they found more than statistics there. They found a model. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of the first to rise from the ashes of war, restructured its shipyards according to the principles applied in Richmond. The same happened in South Korea, where Hyundai, decades later, would become the largest ship manufacturer in the world. Both countries, defeated on the battlefield, became disciples of a methodology born in secret, improvised by a civilian and tested under fire. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of everyone all the time. It was not a military secret, it was productive common sense, a logic that said that efficiency can beat excellence and that speed can be deadlier than precision. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and want to see more forgotten stories come to light, enjoy this video and subscribe to the channel. This simple gesture helps us continue to reveal what the books don't tell. Most surprisingly, at the end of the conflict, many of the workers who had been ignored, women, blacks, immigrants, returned to anonymity. But the method they built in silence won the world. The freighters of peace, the modern cruise ships, the tankers that power the global economy, all today follow the principles of modular assembly and scale production pioneered by Kaiser. Indeed, Henry J. Kaiser, the man who had never seen a shipyard before 1940, can be called the invisible father of the modern shipping industry. At an International Maritime Organization conference in 1971, a Japanese engineer declared, "The future of shipbuilding was born with Liberty ships." No German admiral ever imagined that the greatest legacy of his defeat would come from a concrete mason, armed with timelines and conviction. But this story still holds one last number, a number that does not belong to the economy nor to industry. It belongs to the battlefield, because in the end all these ships would serve a single purpose, to put an entire army on the waters and take you to the beaches of occupied Europe. In 1945, as Berlin burned under the weight of its own collapse, the greatest lesson left by Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards was not in numbers, but in logic. Modern war, at last, revealed its true nature, a test of organization. General George C. Marshall, in his memoirs, was blunt. Courage leads to victory in the field, but production sustains war. The cold analysis of post-war strategists confirmed the same thesis. Michael Porter, decades later, would argue that the competitive advantage of a nation at war is not in its tanks, but in its ability to deliver tanks at a steady pace. Germany had designed the Tiger, an armored monster with millimeter accuracy, but produced fewer than 1,400 units in the entire war. The United States, on the other hand, produced more than 49,000 Shermans. It was the confrontation between isolated genius and mass efficiency, and the same logic applied to the skies and seas. While the Luftwaffe bet on revolutionary planes like the Me-262, Boeing delivered hundreds of B-17s a month. While German submarines were built one by veteran craftsmen, Liberty ships were born in series, with interchangeable parts, tested outside the hull, welded by workmen who had never set foot in a naval classroom. The secret, as the Axis generals understood too late, was in standardization, in schedule, in predictability. In the Kaiser model, the impossible was only what had not yet been schematized. In internal British intelligence reports, recovered after the end of the conflict, there are notes that confirm England's own surprise at the American speed. The American War Production Organization functions like a giant corporation. They don't produce to win a battle, they produce as if they were supplying the world. It was the confirmation of a new military doctrine, integrated logistics as an offensive force. And this learning was not just technical, it was strategic. In studies conducted by the Rand Corporation at the beginning of the Cold War, it was observed that the only absolute advantage of the United States over the USSR was not armament, but organizational. The model of total war based on mobilized civilian production had redefined what national power was. What Kaiser built, with its logic of ready is better than perfect, anticipated the 21st century decades in advance, and even the most resistant critics were forced to accept. In 1946, a former US Navy officer, who had called Kaiser's methods industrial bricolage, wrote, "If we had followed the previous patterns, we would have lost the war in 1943, because in the end, efficiency won over arrogance, and the final number was to be revealed, the total number of ships launched by Kaiser and his crew, a number that would make any U-boat seem irrelevant." 70 years have passed since Henry J. Kaiser transformed a swamp in Richmond into the most efficient naval assembly line on the planet. The technique was assimilated, the data studied, the ships forgotten. But one question still echoes like twisted steel in the archives of history. Could anyone today, with all the technological advances, with artificial intelligence, 3D printers and global networks, be able to repeat the feat? In 4 days, build a 14,000-ton machine, coordinating thousands of workers with handwritten schedules, rail-hauled parts, and engines tuned with analog tools. The comparison is uncomfortable. Today's world lives in an era of hyperconnectivity and hyperspecialization, but also of paralysis due to complexity. The global supply chain is longer, more fragile, and more dependent on consensus. What was once solved with a schedule and a sledgehammer today requires meetings, committees, and interdepartmental validations. The moral force that united the workers in Richmond, the sense of common mission, the brutal pragmatism, the willing sacrifice of comfort for the essentials, seems to have been diluted in a sea of contradictory priorities. There is no shortage of engineers. Kaisers are missing. There is no shortage of software. There is a lack of willingness to get your hands dirty. In a 2022 U.S. Department of Defense report, an excerpt draws attention. The estimated time for reactivation of a large-scale shipyard is 2 to 5 years, depending on logistical alignment, labor availability, and budget authorization. In World War II, Kaiser did it in 9 months. No prerequisites, no guarantees, just urgently. And paradoxically, with less technology, it delivered more results. The provocation is clear. Has technical evolution led to an operational regression? Could it be that in the face of a new global emergency, today's society would be able not only to build ships, but to build cohesion, focus, and sacrifice? The viewer is led to imagine the impossible scene. A Silicon Valley CEO trying to set up a shipyard amid virtual meetings, ESG protocols, and supply chains blocked by international regulations. The image does not generate laughter. It generates silence. Because the past at this point in history no longer serves only as memory. It becomes an uncomfortable mirror, and in looking at him, the modern world may need to admit that despite everything, there is something in Kaiser's crude and straightforward methods that we have not yet been able to overcome. The war may be over, but the question keeps floating, like a liberty in the middle of the ocean, and the answer may lie in the next issue. A number so improbable, so absurd, that not even Nazi Germany dared to calculate. They had no ranks, no when the war ended. They returned to simple houses, working-class neighborhoods, discreet lives. But it was these hands, calloused, hastily trained, invisible to newspapers, that sustained the greatest logistical effort in modern history. While generals were talking about strategy and admirals were discussing naval routes, these workers from Richmond, Portland, Mobile, and so many other quiet spots in America were assembling, screwing, welding, sometimes with 12-hour days, with no right to error, no time for glory, men with little education and women who had never been called to the front lines of industry before the war, blacks, immigrants, widows, teenagers, all operating a production machine that had no room for stardom, only for results. None of them had their names engraved on the bronze plaques of Washington's memorials, but every bolt tightened, every seam welded, every shift completed in the pre-dawn chill contributed to what the British historian Anthony Beevor called the most logistical victory in history, a feat that baffled German intelligence and disproved all classical theories of war. When asked at Nuremberg how the Allies had achieved such an industrial recovery, Officer Hans-Georg von Friedeberg replied bitterly, "They didn't beat us with weapons. They drowned us in steel." And steel, it is worth remembering, did not come out of laboratories. It came out of the oil-smeared hand of someone who may never have understood the map of war, but perfectly understood the meaning of the word urgency. Because for those who were inside a shipyard in 1942, there was no ideology, there was no glory. There was a simple command hanging on the walls: build, or someone dies on the other side of the ocean. The war was won by those who understood that every minute was worth a lung, a load, a chance to cross. And when Henry J. Kaiser took the podium to announce a new production record, he always made a point of repeating, "I'm just the timer. They are the ones who run." The next part of this documentary will reveal the number that never appeared in the history books. The number that sums up all this silent mobilization. A number so unbelievable that to this day, it defies the logic of the impossible. The SS Robert E. Perry went down to sea in 4 days and 15 hours before an incredulous audience and a collapsing doctrine. There at that moment, not only did the pride of the traditional shipyards sink, it also sank the German belief that the Allied logistical chaos was irreversible. The Kriegsmarine had bet on the collapse by attrition, but it underestimated the capacity of a mobilized democracy, of an ignored civilian, of a worker without rank. As submarines began to lose count of the ships appearing on the horizon, the doctrine of attrition was reversed. It was no longer a question of sinking ships, but of accompanying a production that seemed not to respect the laws of time. Germany lost the Atlantic War before it knew it had started it, because in the end, strategy didn't win over logistics. It was shaped by it. Modern warfare does not belong to the most brilliant general, but to the most disciplined assembly line. The liberty was not pretty, nor perfect, but it floated, and it floated by the thousands. The biggest lesson of this story is brutal in its simplicity. Efficiency beats elegance, volume beats precision, the appropriate beats the ideal. As Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments, admitted, "If we had had the production system of the Americans, we would have won, but they didn't, and they lost." If you value research and the search for historical truth, leave your like and subscribe now. This keeps alive the memory of the facts that changed the world. Comment below, what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video? Activate the bell so you don't miss the next story, because the true story always surprises more than any fiction. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.